These are the parts that go into the front brake system. All of the ones down here go to one caliper, so there's another duplicate set of parts like this for the second caliper, but just to keep things simple, I'm only showing one of them. Up here are the parts that go from the brake master cylinder on the handlebar, which connects through this banjo fitting, and then the other end of this flexible line screws into this manifold, and it distributes brake fluid to each brake caliper through these two ports. Now, there's a steel brake line that connects to the manifold like that, and then the other end of that line connects to the flexible hose, and the other end of the flexible hose connects to the second steel brake line, but this one's going to the caliper. So the rubber hose sits in between the two steel brake lines. Now, there's also a grommet, and one of them goes on each end of the flexible hose. The grommet has a shallow and a deep face. The shallow face will go up against the hex nut fitting, and it fits, the whole grommet sort of slides down into this groove. Now this one fits into a bracket like that, and that bracket mounts on one of the slider bolts, and the grommet slides in. So it's where the steel brake line off of the caliper will mate up with the hose. So that's basically the hardware that goes into the front brake system. So this is the left front brake caliper. I painted it a color of blue that's not too far from the anodized calipers that were used only on the 1977 RS model. I kind of liked that, so I went ahead, since I was going to repaint this, and use the blue. And it mounts with these bolts, Allen bolts, and they go through these two holes and go into tapped holes on the fork slider. Now there's red tape over these two bolts. They're the bolts that clamp the caliper halves together, and I haven't torqued them yet. I thought it'd be easier to torque those after I got the caliper mounted, so I will do that after I get it on the bike. Now the manifold I modified, and I put in a stainless plug on this port. That used to hold a brake pressure switch, so it turned the brake light on when you squeezed the front brake lever. I decided not to use this because it has a tendency to hold air in the hole, and that can be really hard to bleed. So I went with the plug and plugged this off and used the switch that's on the handlebar lever to activate the brake light for the front brake. So before I mount the caliper, I want to clean the rotor and make sure there's no oil or grease or anything on it. So I'm going to use some brake cleaner and spray that on a blue shop towel, and then just rotate the wheel and get both the inside and the outside. And as you can see, there's a certain amount of garbage. So I'll continue to do that with clean towels until it comes off clean. So I attach the bracket behind the fork brace and fender bracket here, and it attaches with this bolt that fits on the fork slider, and it's a little loose, so I can just move it because I need to hook this rubber brake line up to the steel line, and to get the threads to align I need a little flexibility. Now I've got the hose inserted into the grommet, and this is the rear caliper with the bleed nipple closest to the wheel and the steel brake line farthest from the wheel. So I'll just slide it on over the disc and just sort of catch the pipe and push it up like that. And then these are threaded, the holes in the slider. So I just run the 2 bolts in like that, and then I'll torque these 2 to 20 foot-pounds. Then I'm going to take the tape off and torque the caliper clamping bolts to 22 foot-pounds. And then I'll thread the fitting into the line and tighten that all up. Now the brake line that comes off the front master cylinder has a banjo bolt and then 2 copper washers to make a sandwich on either side of the banjo fitting. And the fitting bends in this direction, so it makes it come down fairly straight. And it slides inside the fork tube and then up here through the gusset and then to the manifold, and it threads in here to the manifold. Now the manifold's going to mount about like that, using the hose clamp to hold it onto the spine tube. So I have the manifold loosely mounted with the hose clamp, and the screw is on the other side, the screw that tightens up the clamp. So I can adjust it a little if I need to. The other thing to notice that there's a post here on the bracket that holds the starter relay. The hose clamp slides back against that post around the frame. Now the upper steel brake line slides past the frame this way and then comes up and will screw into the manifold like that. Now the other end down here is what's going to connect to the brake hose, and I put the grommet on the shoulder of the hose and it screws in like that, and then this grommet will slide into the fairing. There's a hole for the grommet, so that's how that all goes together. I've got the banjo fitting tightened down, and that line's running over here to the manifold, and then the right side pipe is connected to the flexible brake hose, and that's connected to the pipe that goes into the caliper. And the same configuration over on the left side with the brake fitting here and the line coming down, and then the hose, and then over here to the caliper, and then the steel line going into the caliper. So it's all ready to bleed. So I have the 2 bleed valves closed, and I have brake fluid in the reservoir, and I'm pumping it, and you can see I'm displacing air. So I'll keep adding fluid and keep displacing air with the bleed valves closed, filling up as much of the master cylinder as I can. I'm going to use my air zapper, which is a vacuum pump, and I'm going to pull brake fluid out of the bleed nipple here, and that should pull a lot of the air out at the same time. So I just turn it on and then open up the bleed valve, and it's pulling fluid and hopefully air bubbles, and I'll keep an eye on the fluid reservoir so it doesn't go dry. So after I used the air zapper on both calipers, the brake lever was feeling pretty firm. So I think I got all the air out. But there's a little trick I like to use, and I take a small bungee cord, wrap it around the brake lever so it's pulled back, which puts the front brake system under pressure. And I let it sit like that for overnight. And what generally that will do is, if the system's under pressure, the air bubbles are going to rise to the top, which will be here into the fluid reservoir, and it usually purges anything that's hiding out somewhere in a nook or cranny. So I think it's a simple solution to guarantee I've got all the air out and it doesn't require me to do any work.